Southwell is Senior Director of the Science in the Public Sphere program in RTI, International Center for Communication Science. He is adjunct professor of internal medicine with Duke University and a graduate faculty member and adjunct associate professor in health behavior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Southwell has published widely on topics such as public understanding of science. He co-founded the Duke program on medical misinformation to improve patient-provider conversations about misinformation, and also has published a book on misinformation and mass audiences, and various articles on the topic. Dr. Southwell was recently appointed to the advisory committee for the Council of Medical Specialty Societies, National Academy of Medicine, World Health Organization collaboration on identifying credible sources of health information in social media. He also has organized several summits on trust in science and medical misinformation, such as the Misinformation Solutions Forum sponsored by the Rita Allen Foundation in conjunction with Aspen Institute. In addition, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Southwell created and hosts the Measure of Everyday Life, a public radio show that translates research for general audiences. And I subscribed to this show on my podcast, which is really awesome. I recommend that you guys follow Dr. Southwell on the show. Now, on more or less a personal note, I believe Dr. Southwell is one of the most forward-thinking health communication scholars of our time. And I also grateful for his mentoring while I was at University of Minnesota as a graduate student. So it's really an honor today for us to host his important talk on misinformation as a societal concern. So with that, Dr. Southwell, please take it over.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellie. I was really looking forward to giving this talk for a while. I'm a big fan of the program at Maryland, but it's also really been a distinct pleasure to see the ways that Professor Nan's career has unfolded here since the time that we were both at University of Minnesota. So I really appreciate the chance to reconnect on that level as well. I'm sure that you all are regularly having really great conversations up there about theory and about research in different ways. So today, I'm happy to talk to you about what has become a buzzword topic. I hopefully by the end of our conversation, we will introduce maybe some new ways of thinking about this. And I'd certainly invite a longer conversation than we're going to have time for here today. So certainly feel free to connect with me on social media in all kinds of different ways after we talk. I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to share my screen. Give me just a moment. Okay. And I'll be happy to offer some remarks, and then certainly feel free to put ideas that you might have in the chat or to raise them after, and we can talk about all of that as well. So this is a topic, as I mentioned, that certainly has been in the headlines quite a bit recently. And it's been fascinating to see that happen. As somebody who's worked on misinformation for a number of years, to see the white hot focus, on misinformation in the last couple of years in particular. But as I want to talk about here today, I think there's a longer history of thinking about this worry and concern that really should be informing, how we are approaching this phenomenon. Back in 2021, of course, the U.S. Surgeon General's office declared health misinformation to be an active threat to public health and well-being. And this was an interesting moment in the political arena, as well as the spotlight got put on the phenomenon. And then all of a sudden you have different entities across the country worrying and thinking about how we might intervene with regards to misinformation. Some of our work was cited in this report, and as a result of that, we were getting calls from a variety of places. For example, the county government in San Diego, it was interested in this all of a sudden, as a threat to to well-being, in the county. And so lots of questions were asked about, what might we do about this, as though somehow it was this novel threat. And I guess part of what I want to emphasize here today is that there are ways in which we actually have been struggling with this concern for quite some time. In fact, even if you just extend a few years prior to the pandemic, misinformation has been in the air and has been in the headlines, for a variety of reasons that extend beyond health and medicine. Back in 2018. The Washington Post declared misinformation to be its word of the year, and many other media outlets did something similar. And part of the reason for that has been the prevalence of false claims in the political arena, and the worry about this as a concern. So certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen quite a bit of concern, particularly about this as somehow this dysfunctional aspect of our information environment that is complicating all of our lives. This has driven really an explosion of work in the academic literature on misinformation. My colleagues and I have had an opportunity to contribute in some different ways to that. And there are a variety of different questions that we've started to address. Questions about why it is that misinformation spreads. How is it that perhaps we could stop people from sharing misinformation? How is it that perhaps we could mitigate the effects of misinformation once it's out there? And we're starting to get some answers to some of these questions, but we're also still in the early days of this sort of explosion of work. And I imagine that some of you on the call right now might be engaged in some of this yourself. And so as you do that, what I want to do is, we can talk in distinct ways about some of these specific questions, but I also want us to think perhaps a little bit differently about how we use the word and the phrase, about how it is that we think it's come to pass as a concern. And I think that actually would inform some of the intervention that we might encourage moving forward, that looks a little bit different than some of the early days interventions that have been suggested. So I want to raise the question as to whether we're approaching misinformation in the most useful way. It's certainly, I think, healthy and good for us as researchers to consider this possibility of there being false information circulating in the wider information environment. We know that that's a part of what people encounter, so it makes sense to understand how people make sense of that. But I think we also need to probably go beyond a lot of the efforts that we've seen to simply track the amount and prevalence of misinformation, because I'm not sure that just simply tracking it actually explains, the reasons for its being, the reasons why it has become popular, the reasons why it has become perhaps prevalent. And I also think it's important for us to resist some of the temptation to think about misinformation solely in terms of it going viral, or in terms of it somehow being itself a novel virus, because I think the metaphor breaks down in some important ways as we think about this. I think epidemiological thinking on this is not a horrible place to start, but I think we also need more subtlety and nuance here, because there are ways in which, for example, the coronavirus is different than a piece of misinformation may be. There might be some similarities, but there are also probably some important differences. And so some colleagues and I raised some of those concerns a few years ago, and on the heels of a National Cancer Institute workshop, in which we raised this question as to whether or not we're approaching misinformation in the best way possible, and suggested some different directions for thought. In addition to the academic research, part of what I want to call our attention to here today is the news environment and popular culture, because all of a sudden we have seen reference to misinformation in addition to a variety of other phrases, in popular discourse. You'll see those here in this NBC News headline. as an example of some of what's been out there. And I want to caution us, to really be critical in terms of thinking about some of the patterns that have been reported. This isn't to suggest that some of those patterns aren't necessarily based in an empirical reality, but I think that we somehow have gotten the framing and the emphasis a bit wrong at times. And I think there's real consequence for that. So here's an example of this in the fall of 2021. NBC News reports, and I'll just see the headline here directly, that Latinos are more likely to get, consume, and share online misinformation. They also use a phrase there that you won't hear me utter very often because I'm not fond of it, as an unhelpful phrase to describe misinformation. And this is based in actual research results, but I think there are aspects of this correlation, if you will, that imply a causation that I don't think is necessarily appropriate. I think that we end up, looking at differences, demographic differences in terms of exposure, and somehow inferring from that perhaps preference for misinformation or differential vulnerability, to misinformation in ways that I think potentially are going to do damage to our understanding of different groups. It's not to say that some of those exposure differences aren't real, but we have to think about how they came to be. And what it is that actually explains and accounts for some of those differences, because I think that's an important part of the story as well. So some of you on the call might be interested in not only misinformation, but also another hot topic in recent years, the notion of health disparities. And what I want to point out here is we actually recently, a few colleagues of mine and I had a chance to really do a deep dive and ask the question whether there are points of intersection between those two areas. So the annual review of public health actually invited us to do a pretty comprehensive look at the literature on health misinformation as it may relate to health disparities, and to ask, as it was originally posed to us, perhaps whether or not health misinformation actually leads to health disparities. And we addressed that question. The short answer is that we think it's more important perhaps to question the way that question is framed, because there are, I think, important points of intersection between those areas, but we're not necessarily ready to suggest that it's solely a matter of misinformation, which has led to many of the disparities that we see. So I'd encourage you that actually the preprint of that is out and available now online at annual reviews. And this was a good opportunity for me to work with colleagues at UNC and Duke, and actually the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, to really ask this question in terms of what evidence we have, to date. And I think that we need a lot more evidence. This is a good call to arms for those of you that are interested in doing this kind of work, because I think there are a lot of questions that we haven't really sufficiently answered yet with regards to this topic. So here I am about 10 minutes, 15 minutes into a talk on misinformation. And I've used the word, we all, I think, have a sense of what I'm talking about, and yet I haven't defined it. And I think this is a real problem, actually, for much of the research that's out there. I think we probably need to do a better job of getting on the same page as to what we mean, by misinformation, and specifically by scientific misinformation. Because I think if we are able to do that, there are careful theoretical definitions that we can offer that point the way to the future of research in this area. And I think that we've seen a lot of what I'll say is somewhat sloppy use of the term and the phrase to refer to all kinds of things. And I think we probably need to be a bit more narrow there, and also to be careful, that we're not ruling out, various scientific endeavors, for example, which often lead to the iteration of knowledge, over time. So some colleagues and I were invited to define scientific misinformation for a special issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And we did that over the course of months, and it was a really interesting consensus effort, here, to again work with colleagues from different institutions, to put together what we think is a defensible definition. But I've broken up the definition here on the screen and some ways to emphasize some different pieces of it. Some of it I think is not going to be controversial to you. It's not going to be surprising that we're referring to information that's misleading or deceptive, for example. But we also look at a couple of other components. We emphasize information that's publicly available, here in terms, and so really moving beyond necessarily what might be privately whispered between two people to at least something that is discoverable, more broadly in the information environment. But we also emphasize on deception or misleading information relative to the best available evidence at the time. And we do this because it's quite possible for a scientific claim that was made in 1975 to have been backed by the best available evidence at the time, and for our evidence to be updated now. And so we want to be careful, not to rule out some of the scientific effort that goes into the production of knowledge, and I think that we would actually have the situation where we are perhaps inviting critique of science as an endeavor if we don't actually make that distinction. We also think that there's a really important consideration here that is really one that underscores the social nature of this phenomenon. And so here in this part of the definition, we actually note that misinformation counters statements by actors who adhere to scientific principles without adding accurate evidence for consideration. The reason we do that is to start to draw attention to the idea that what we're really talking about is people that are not relying on evidence that's been generated by the scientific method. And I think that the importance here is to suggest that it's not just scientists who somehow are arbiters of the truth, but they are those that are pointing to accurate information because they've used a scientific process in looking at evidence. So we have to get away from kind of the team sport aspect of this. And I think that actually, frankly, sometimes scientists and researchers and others are offended that different audiences aren't listening to them. But they've also got to think about whether or not they are basing what they're saying in the scientific process and scientific evidence, as opposed to just espousing opinions. And so we think that there's the sociological dimension of this is really key, that there are instances in which you've got people sort of operating outside of the scientific process that are generating claims, and that's really a problem because it's undermining what we think is a useful process for gathering evidence for decision making. But framed in this way, all of a sudden it becomes a little bit more of a social phenomenon, than simply pointing to truth or falsehood, and it moves us away a little bit from just assuming that certain groups are arbiters of the capital T truth. I also think that it's important for us to look at all this in terms of historical context. So I pointed in the beginning of this talk to the ways in which misinformation is a novelty in our headlines recently, but this shouldn't suggest that misinformation itself is a new phenomenon. In fact, we've been struggling with this, in this country, in the U.S., and other places for quite a long time. There are a couple of examples here that I can point to help make that case. If you look back, roughly 100 years or so, to some of the early concerns that were raised over fraudulent advertising, here you can see lots of examples that actually led to some of our regulatory oversight of medical claims and ads that we have today, with the current Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Trade Commission, and some of that actually stems from examples that have contributed to our colloquial language. If I were to call any one of you a snake oil salesman or a snake oil salesperson, you would be offended by that. Chances are you would think that I was insulting you, and that's because the phrase has come to mean someone who is peddling in falsehoods, peddling falsehoods. And I want to point out that actually, though, that comes from real effort to promote snake oil liniment, as a health cure that was really unwarranted in a lot of ways. And so you can see lots of examples of promotion for snake oil, and this, it's not just a turn of phrase, that it actually was rooted in a historical reality that led to some of our current regulatory oversight. fast forward here to the late 1930s, and there are a couple of additional examples that I want to point out. One of these happens in a way that has since influenced popular culture. It's the War of the Worlds incident. In the late 1930s, 1938, there was a radio broadcast of a serialization, a dramatization of the H.G. Wells novel, War of the Worlds, that Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater Players had produced and had aired on the radio. The way it was produced, though, was clever in terms of it sounded like a variety hour show. And if you missed the introduction and you tuned in after the introduction suggesting that this was a play, you would have been led to believe that you were listening to a variety show that sporadically was interrupted by these news bulletins which suggested that New Jersey was being invaded by Martians. And of course, to the best of our knowledge, that turned out to not be true. But nonetheless, a lot of people were, led, at least on that night, to think that might have been the case. And so there's a lot of worry and concern. This actually, in some ways, drove a number of sociologists to think about, the power of this new medium of radio as something that could mislead in addition to inform. And so in a lot of ways, the contemporary study of communication was informed by this early, really situation of misinformation, on the radio. Around that same time, there's a political cartoon that has been circulated again recently because it was so prescient at the time. In the late 1930s, you can see a political cartoon here that depicts societal leaders as being, essentially led off of a cliff, here into the abyss of smallpox at the time, and that misinformation is somehow responsible for this situation, is the suggestion. And in a lot of ways, if we were to just replace smallpox with COVID-19, this wouldn't seem that far off, other than perhaps the figures being slightly dressed in a slightly anachronistic way. Nonetheless, this is something that people have been worried about for quite some time. So I just want to point out that it's not really just been the COVID-19 pandemic, but really in lots of previous situations, people have been worried that people have been misled by misinformation. So as a phenomenon, then I think we need to look at misinformation as something that's not going anywhere anytime soon. And there are really 4 good reasons why this is going to continue to be a persistent problem. This is going to continue to be an area that we can inquire about for quite some time. The first is the idea that our best read of the cognitive psychology literature suggests that we're actually biased towards the acceptance of information at face value. This is not to suggest that we can't be critical about misinformation, that we can't use our critical capacity for debunking myths that are out there, but it is to suggest that at first pass that we tend to accept information and then evaluate it as being true or false. And in fact, from a neurological perspective, it turns out that we use different parts of our brain in initially processing information and then making sense of it and tagging it as being true or false. This stems all the way back here to a longstanding debate, essentially through letters between Spinoza and Descartes, 2 old philosophers. But that's been a debate that's gone on for quite some time. And I think in the 20th and 21st centuries, we've seen lots of good cognitive psychology evidence to suggest that actually, we are biased towards the initial acceptance of information, and we aren't able to just screen it out as somehow being false at the point of contact. So why that matters for our current moment is that it is so easy to share misinformation with 1,000 of your friends on social media that you can imagine people that are in situations of being tired, or fatigued or not motivated, to quickly encounter misinformation and to share it with others on social media before they've had time to really critically engage it. And I think that clash between our old human tendency and this new technological possibility is part of what's led us to this current moment. It's also the case that as human beings, we're social beings. We've seen that certainly in the pandemic, ways in which we've missed talking to each other. Certainly, we see this in all kinds of other aspects of life. But what I want to point out is that as social beings, we have lots of reasons for talking to one another. Not all of those reasons directly link to our interest in just sharing the perfect truth with one another. There's lots of reasons why we share information and misinformation. And an example that I often raise here is a situation that now many of us are in again. We haven't been for a while, but now we're back to a situation of going back to buildings and maybe seeing somebody that in the elevator, step onto the elevator, and you might talk about the weather, how the weather is out, and chances are that you're not necessarily sharing new information because you both were just outside. But nonetheless, you acknowledge, that person for really all kinds of reasons. As you're trying to talk to them as a member of your community, you're acknowledging that they are somebody that is worthy of your attention, that you want to, not shun them. And I think we see a lot of that online, where people are, reinforcing their sense of identity and sharing misinformation, and not necessarily worrying about just being perfectly accurate. The other reasons that I think are important for us to point out is that, in a country like the US, we have a regulatory approach, that tends to not censor, and eliminate misinformation from the airwaves before it ever has a chance to appear. And we have what we often refer to as post hoc detection. I do a lot of work at RTI with the Food and Drug Administration, and I think the best way to characterize the Food and Drug Administration's approach, to false claims in, for example, prescription drug ads, is to note that they certainly detect such problems. They certainly sometimes ask for the those that have been responsible for those campaigns to issue, for example, corrective advertising. But what they don't do is sit around and review everything before it goes on air and decide what goes on air or decide what appears on the internet. So we don't have a situation that perfectly protects people from exposure to misinformation. We have a situation in which there are consequences sometimes for making those kind of claims, but not always. But it's nonetheless the case that many of our audiences can be expected to encounter misinformation, and can be continue to expect. We can continue to expect that they are going to encounter that because of the nature of our regulatory regime. The last, and just a side point there, I don't think we would want to change that, because we would have a situation of censorship that I think many of us would worry about otherwise. The last point here is one that I want to also raise, because I actually do think that it's possible to correct misperceptions. Some of the literature suggested otherwise, but I think that's actually a possibility. But we know that it turns out to be difficult to do. You have to meet fire with fire in terms of the level of exposure, and you've got to be pretty blunt and direct in terms of, and explicit in saying that you're pointing out a falsehood. And so all that suggests that much of what we currently see are tepid efforts to mitigate that really don't really add up to much. It's not enough to just put a warning on a website somewhere that nobody's going to read. You really would have to have a full-scale corrective effort in order to overcome those misperceptions. So I want to talk about some of the wrinkles and complications here then that make this an interesting area to investigate, but that also suggests that we're need to move to different points of intervention than what we've conventionally had. One of the aspects of this that's really fascinating is the role of emotion. Again, as human beings, we enjoy emotion. It's an important and valuable part of our life. But it also does complicate our information processing. And that's important, for us to keep in mind. Another former graduate student of mine, Brian Weeks, who's now at the University of Michigan, has done some work on this to find that anger actually encourages the acceptance of inaccurate information. You can imagine the implication of that in the political environment, but I think it also holds important implications with regards to health and medicine. And so we've got to think about emotion in really important ways, and we tend not to do that. We tend to investigate, this work in an abstraction, in a situation where people are not upset at 3 a.m, but rather they're calmly filling out a survey, in a psychology class or a communication class, and that's different. We've got to think about ways to find situations and contexts where people are in emotional distress, and then studying their their information processing responses. I also want to raise here some examples of misinformation which has proliferated, and what we can learn from that. And here I like to raise the example of Belle Gibson, whose story I first learned about when I was getting ready to give a keynote address in Australia. Actually, prior to the pandemic, I had the opportunity to fly over and talk about misinformation. And in doing that, I looked at the landscape, I looked at popular culture in Australia, and learned about Belle Gibson, who was a social media influencer. Who was really quite popular for all of the claims that she made about overcoming cancer, through various nutritional efforts. And as it turns out, there were some real problems with her story, not the least of which was that she apparently never had cancer. And so her whole, she was fraud in many different ways. But I think that while we can, really be concerned about Belle Gibson from an ethical perspective, what's fascinating about the Belle Gibson story is the fact that she became so popular in the first place. So yes, she was promoting lies, but why is it that she became such a popular social media influencer? That's the question I think we really need to ask. And for me, I think that the answer lies in some of our basic human needs. Now, we've already talked about our need for social connection, but I also think that as human beings, we need hope for the future. And in situations when we don't have that, misinformation can offer a really powerful salve in a lot of ways. That if we are missing connection with one another, we're feeling alienated, we don't feel a sense of hope for the future, misinformation can offer not only something to talk about, not only a reason to connect with others, but also a real reason to be optimistic about the future. If you think about it, Belle Gibson was offering those that listened to her a sense of hope in the face of what has been a devastating disease of cancer for many people. And so we've got to pay attention to ways in which misinformation itself is attractive and what function it serves for people, even if it seems like it may be dysfunctional in some ways, even if there are negative consequences. I do think we need to think about why it is that people might be drawn in the first place. Now, all of this, to me, leaves us with a stance of empathy, which is very different than I think we often have in terms of the stances that we often take in approaching misinformation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. Generally speaking, as we ask the question, what is it we can do about all this? I think we've got to find ways to be better students of the concept of trust. I think we've got to find ways to instill and rebuild and maintain trust in different information sources, because personally, I think part of the problem would be solved if we had people adhering to and paying attention to credible sources of information, and not necessarily lured to pay attention to all kinds of other sources. I don't think we're going to be able to vanquish all the misinformation that exists from the internet, but I do think we might be able to draw people into consistent and credible sources of information. And we've got to ask what they're not getting out of those sources and ask why it is that they're turning to other sources, and instead of just bemoaning the fact that they are. So I think we really need to focus more on building trust and perhaps less on blaming those that initially don't trust us. I think that's a stance that's important for all of us in academic situations. So for me, a part of what becomes interesting about this then is to consider how it is that trust comes to be. And I think what's important about this is that we often have not been very sophisticated in thinking about trust itself as a concept. If we were to ask, what constitutes trust, many of us would think about intellectual credibility, about the sense that so-and-so knows what they're talking about. But we know that in talking to people that there's a lot more to it than that. You might think that X or Y person is smart, but you may not necessarily think that they have your best interests at heart. And so not only is reliability and consistency important, credibility is important, but there also seems to be an important dimension here of shared interest that we often overlook. So one of the reasons why a person may not pay attention to a certain institutional outlet in terms of information is that they may not think that people in that institution care whether they live or die. And if that's the case, then it makes a lot more sense why they might be turning to other more outlandish sources, and why they might be vulnerable here to misinformation. We see this in all kinds of ways, but I think increasingly it's important for us to consider trust and consider understanding of the scientific process as important elements of public understanding of science more broadly. And that's something that's arisen recently. I worked with colleagues in the National Science Foundation on the latest iteration of the Science and Engineering Indicators Biennial Report, on that science and engineering indicators, it reports on a variety of dimensions of the state of science in the U.S. But one aspect of that is public understanding of science. And so we worked on the latest iteration of that, which was published in May of this year. And we shifted the focus away from a popular understanding of certain scientific facts towards a greater understanding of trust in institutions and a greater understanding of popular understanding of scientific processes, because we think that matters in really important ways. We've also seen trust matter in other infectious disease emergencies. A few years ago, we were facing the Ebola crisis, and CDC partnered with RTI to do some work. And one of the things that we found mattered most in getting people to adhere to recommendations for screening and for monitoring, as we were talking with inbound travelers from various West African countries that were facing an Ebola outbreak, what really seemed to matter here was trust in CDC, trust in an ambassador that was sent to each of these airports to talk with people. Trust really predicted traveler intention to cooperate. And so it was a complicating factor and a factor here that it would be hard to tell this story without talking about institutional trust. We've also seen this in the environmental context in different ways. We did some work with colleagues at Duke University recently, actually on public engagement with information related to wildfires. And what we found here was that local sources really matter because those are sources people think have shared interest with them, and so that has really strong implications for federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, who was part of this project. We actually had somebody from this project on working with us, but it really matters here, I think, as to how the extent to which various audiences think that large-scale institutions actually have their best interests at heart. And that's something that I think is important for us to emphasize. So for public engagement, we ultimately are going to need to do more than just simply present facts. We're going to need to do more than just present information. And I know this is something that many of you regularly understand, but I think it matters here in the case of misinformation as well. So I think ultimately, part of what we have to do is find ways to identify and uplift the shared interests that that do exist, between organizations and people outside of those organizations. But we often aren't emphasizing that. We often are emphasizing, here are the facts, here are the things you need to know. Here's this expert that we have who knows a lot. But I think we might need to lead first with reasons why the federal government, for example, cares about what's happening in some rural area and cares about whether or not people are okay. And I think that's something that we sometimes don't sufficiently emphasize. We've seen this in a variety of ways pop up as a theme. We have seen this in, for example, a summit that we organized at RTI on building trust in science, and it turned out that there were really simple steps that a lot of folks realized that we need to be taking that we aren't always taking. We've got to do a better job of promoting transparency and openness, in science. We do need to equip audiences for critical inquiry and to be better information searchers and seekers, but we also need to educate scientists to become better communicators and to be more empathetic in their approach. So this is, for me personally, informed a lot of the initiatives, and I'll just touch on a couple of these before I'm turning to your questions. But for me, this has been really transformative in important ways. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to consult with Excite, which is the network of professional science museum professionals in Europe, and went over to Copenhagen for a few days. And they wanted to put together a workshop on combating misinformation, going to battle with misinformation. And we were able to do was kind of subtly move that frame towards away from fact-checking and battle and towards this idea that science museums can be places of community forums and places to bring communities together and places to encourage trust in institutions, and that turned out to be a really important pivot in that dialogue. Similarly, we saw this pop up in some of the solutions that people posed in the Misinformation Solutions Forum that we referred to a moment ago, and you can see some of this in a white paper that's available through RTI Press. And The last initiative that I want to note here is the Duke program on medical misinformation, which is really a program that's rooted in this idea that we need more empathy, and that we need to do a better job of supporting our clinicians who are on the front line of our engagement with various patients as they deal with the challenging circumstance of patients who are referring to misinformation. A couple of years ago, we did a study here in North Carolina amongst licensed medical practitioners. What we found was that almost all of them, like 94, 95%, regularly encountered patient misinformation. When you ask that group then if they've ever been trained as to what to do about that situation, less than a fifth had ever had received any training. So something like 18% had ever actually had any kind of reference to what to do when a patient refers to misinformation. So this was the really genesis of the Duke program on medical misinformation, where we have, through a variety of means, put together virtual workshops for clinicians that encourage them to talk with patients in ways that don't look down, that don't shame and blame, but that instead take a stance of empathy, ask people why it is that the misinformation that they're presenting, at least why was it important to them to raise it. People themselves don't know that it's necessarily misinformation, and so you can ask questions about why that kind of information is important to you, find out what their values are, and then point them to credible sources of information that speak to the relevance of the dimensions of their particular values that they're raising. So ultimately here, I think if we ask the question, what can be done? These might seem simple and straightforward, but I just don't think we see this happening nearly enough. I think we need to encourage compassion for audiences. That's awful difficult to do when you're judging, those same audiences for being gullible, for complicating our lives and not listening to official medical pronouncements. But nonetheless, I think that's the only way forward. I think we've got to do a much better job in embracing translation opportunities. And I mean this not just linguistically, but culturally, but also in terms of unpacking complicated scientific concepts. We need communication researchers, we need communication practitioners to officially be liaisons and translators between scientific institutions and various audiences. We don't do that nearly enough. And I think that that's something that is really going to come back to bite us in the future. So I'd like to see us investing more from a workforce perspective in formal science communication professionals and translation professionals. We also have to do a better job of of learning what people are encountering, even though that might be distasteful to us. This is going to mean, figuring out what's circulating on the internet, even if we're going to be really disgusted by that. I think we've got to do a better job of figuring out what's out there and not just assuming that we know all of that. And then lastly, I do think there are ways to empower people to be better information seekers on their own. So we can't, none of this is to suggest we should just accept people's embrace of conspiracy theories as being accurate and being okay. This isn't to suggest that we should ever say that false information is true just because we want to make other people feel better. What it's suggesting is that we ought to embrace their fellow humanity, but we ought to suggest that they have a right to their own values and perspective, but that we could do a better job, I think, together of trying to help them seek the information they need to make the decisions that they need to do to keep themselves and their families healthy. So with that, I want to thank everybody. I'm going to stop my screen sharing here so we get to some comments and questions. And I see here already a good question in the chat. And it's a question from Michelle Green, and then I see a lot of hands and some applause. Too. Thanks for all the applause, and I'll get to all the hands here in just a minute. There's an important distinction here between misinformation and disinformation. Michelle, I appreciate that you raised that. For me, I tend to use the word misinformation as an umbrella term that actually encompasses disinformation as a subset. Disinformation we often can think about as that which has been actively promoted and intentionally so as deception. Misinformation can include that, but it also can include some of the noise that's out there. There's a lot of earnest journalism that makes mistakes. For example, there's a lot of instances where there's just complicated or misleading or ambiguous phrasing to language. some of it's not intentionally put out to deceive. I think we can certainly ask really important questions about the ethics of those that intentionally deceive, and we should probably be pretty harsh in our addressing in our effort to address those folks. But I also think there's a lot of misinformation that's also complicating, which it's tough to tell what the authorship of it is. It's tough to tell whether it was intentional, but we still know that it's complicating audience decision making and patient decision making. So we still have to worry about that too. So Michelle, that was a great question. I see here, Sahar, I think you've got a question, so I'll turn to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for an excellent and engaging presentation. It was very informative. I was really glad to see the last part about what can be done, because I'm very concerned about this particular issue on a personal and professional basis. On a personal basis, I do have some relatives back in Egypt who are still up till this moment doubtful about the virus, about the corona pandemic, about whether vaccines are safe or not. And these people are not getting their information from Dr. Fauci. They get a lot of the misinformation / disinformation on some social media platforms. I wonder if we as scientists also have a way to actually simplify some scientific facts and be able to also share them more broadly using digital media and new media to be able to reach out to all of these different groups. But that brings me to the second point, which I'm concerned about professionally, which is the digital divide. And it's no secret that the coronavirus pandemic had a number of serious effects on our lives. And one of them has been increasing the digital disparities between technological haves and have-nots. And therefore, those who are in Egypt and other parts of the developing world do not have the same degree of access to information that we do, for example, here in the US or other parts of the developed world. So it brings another challenge to the equation, which is really how to also bridge some of these technological divides and digital divide, and what role can we possibly play as scientists and academics and those who are concerned with spreading the truth in terms of bridging some of these gaps and divides moving forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, there's a lot of work to do, right? It's a good reason for you to be doing the work that you're doing. And I would suggest that something that's crucial, it might be frustrating. I say this to clinicians all the time. This comes up, that this might sound like a strange thing to say. A clinician will say, gosh, I'm really worried about this. I'm hearing all kinds of misinformation amongst my patients. And this really feels like a failure. And I actually say that I think there's a success or a victory in that. And what I mean by that is the fact that they're hearing that means that the person trusts them enough to share it with them, and that's a good first step. So in your case, the fact that you are connected to those conversations means that at least you are in a stance of communion with those audiences, that you could be an ambassador in important ways in terms of talking about how science works, explaining your thought processes. And I think it's better for us to hear about it than to not, because if we get to a situation where nobody's hearing each other at all, then we have almost complete polarization, and that's even more dangerous. I worry more about situations where we don't know what's happening in these corners of social media and others. If we're hearing about all of it in a big, messy democracy, that's better than if we're just keeping to ourselves, because otherwise we're completely keeping to ourselves. Frankly, that's the basis for civil war, and we don't want to be in a situation like that. I think in terms of the digital divide, I really appreciate you raising this too. This is something that back 10 years ago, I wrote a book on social networks in which I essentially argued something similar and saying, look, as much as and as powerful as social media are, I worry that if we turn to those as sort of our solution only, we're going to reinforce some of the disparities that exist, because you're going to see the information rich get richer, and you're going to see others left out. So we've got to do a better job, frankly, of working in local communities and scaling up that effort. It's going to be incredibly hard work, but I think a decentralized approach where we're trying to scale up lots of local efforts is so much more important. We saw this with the SEAL initiative by the National Institutes of Health that RTI was able to collaborate on, and some other efforts where I think it might seem like at small scale to be out in barbershops and community centers and other, but actually that's the only way forward. And what we need to do are international efforts that are really rooted in those interpersonal connections in addition to social media. So I would agree very strongly with that. I want to turn here to an old friend and colleague, Dr. Klevitsky. So it's nice to see you on the screen as well. So Peter, it's good to see you. And what's your question or comment?
Good morning, Brian, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I would ask, what should we be doing for those of us that work with a lot of undergraduates? Is there a way that we can embed a required media literacy or scientific literacy component into our courses? Or basically, how do we combat this this real sense of skepticism that's not rooted in understanding more, but that's skeptical of the whole enterprise.
Yeah.
What sort of strategies would you suggest for those of us like myself who work with a lot of undergraduate students?
Yeah.
And thank you, Brian, for all of your work.
Yeah.
It really is path setting in so many ways.
Well, I really appreciate that. So I'd say, first of all, let's recognize just the crucial importance of those introductory, undergraduate courses. Like, what a vital and great opportunity. And that's something that those of us, once you're in a situation of being a tenured faculty member and all that, just realize you're doing really important work, with those courses. I really think that's crucial. There actually, the Misinformation Solutions Forum that we put together a few years ago, there was a team from the Indiana University Kokomo who actually had developed a media literacy curriculum that they were going to be implementing, sort of across the board. It might be worthwhile looking at some of their efforts. I do think that generally speaking, we make some really wrong assumptions sometimes about new generations of students. I think we assume that they somehow, because they've grown up with digital technology, in many cases, that they are altogether, maybe more immune or savvy or under. I think that that's not necessarily the case. I think they're just as vulnerable to misinformation as many of us have been. I do think that generally speaking, we have a sense of their cynicism and apathy that's not quite rooted in reality either. I don't think anybody wants to be misled. I think people want accurate information. I think we don't make it very easy on them. I think I have some sympathy for ways in which it's complicated now, but at the same time, we also do have search engine tools and other tools and tactics that do make it easier to look up information than has ever been the case. So I think encouraging people to be consumers of information, to take advantage of what's out there in the information environment, not to accept it at face value just what's being fed to them, but at the same time recognizing there are still good repositories of information is important. I think that now is a good time as any to instill the values of journalism and emphasizing why that's important to a society. I think it's not too much of an overstatement to say that I think that some of the work that happens in schools of journalism and mass communication, frankly, is important to the preservation of democracy, and I think that in situations like the ones that we have here in the U.S. So I think I do think, Peter, you're onto something. I think not making assumptions about lack of interest on the part of students, not making assumptions about students, I think is probably important. And encouraging this as part of life skills and professional skills for everybody, regardless of whether or not they want themselves to go on and be a news anchor or be an advertiser, that's really important. So I think efforts to center communication programs at the heart of liberal arts programs, at the heart of university programs, and making those courses, so administratively it can be hard to do sometimes, but making those courses open to others that are not just in the major, I think that's vital. And centering it as and maybe partnering with the same place where a student might turn to for an introduction to democratic principles or to political science, they ought to be thinking about mass communication or other courses like that as well. Okay, so I want to turn to the chat here. We've got a couple of comments. Michelle's raised a comment here, and fair enough, in terms of there being certain types of sources that you have a strong visceral reaction to. What I would like to posit, and I think that's open for empirical investigation, is that unfortunately, no matter who the source is, I think there comes a moment of initial engagement where we still are dealing with the reality of what was said. I think you quickly are probably able to, I just think what's probably happening in your case, Michelle, is a quick rejection and a quick employment of other built up parts of your brain. But I still think, unfortunately, and it's kind of awful to think about that, but there's the reality is that there's still this moment of encounter where we assume, well, could this be true? And that's all I'm suggesting, is that's kind of the process by which we do this. I think that in many cases we can train ourselves to overcome and resist that. I think that's where we need to be. So it's not to suggest we are going to be brainwashed. Shali?
Thank you, Brian. That was such a rich and provocative talk. I just, in the remaining time, I was hoping that maybe you can comment a little bit more about what's the optimal approach to this misinformation problem, because I've seen recently there have been some arguments against just devoting all our resources to countering misinformation like 100%.
Yep.
Instead, maybe we should channel most of our resources to elevate reliable information. So it's like, the two things we can do, either you just, attend to misinformation, or on the other hand, increase accessibility or acceptance of reliable information. So there's a trade-off, and to give a limited resources, which approach would be more of a priority?
Yeah, no, I think it's not to assume that misinformation doesn't exist would be a problem. To assume that it isn't a part of the reality of our public discourse would be a problem. So we've got to keep raising this. And I think academic inquiry on it is perfectly fine. But to assume that all of the remedy is going to be a function of us combating it or addressing it, and that's always going to leave us in a stance of defense. And the metaphor that I often use, and some of you might have heard me give this metaphor before, but I think it's a good one. If you ever go to a carnival or a state fair, in the U.S. in particular, you'll see there's this carnival game known as whack-a-mole, where basically these things keep coming out of different holes, and you have to use a mallet to kind of address them, to whack them. And I think that's what we're going to be facing with misinformation. We're constantly going to be trying to. It's always going to pop up, somewhere else. So I think instead, we would be well served to build up our institutions. Why are we not drawing people to? And we've seen this actually during the pandemic. There's a resurgence of interest during worries about the drifting of our country into political turmoil. We've seen the resurgence of public media as the source people turn to, but it's not always the case that those sources serve all of our information needs. So we probably need to build them up further. But I do think that was actually part of the recent effort that I've been part of. That we've partnered with YouTube. Actually, YouTube is interested in this. With the National Academies and the Council for Medical Specialties and WHO. It's just exactly the same idea. What can we do to better elevate credible sources? Somewhat of a flippant comment, but it's probably not, selling that credibility for, $8. That's probably not it, in terms of the check mark, but on Twitter. But I do think that there are ways that we can probably put a better spotlight on those sources. It comes back to the importance of capital J journalism. It comes back to providing sources. It comes back to ways that health institutions themselves can be sources of information. They don't do a great job often of necessarily sharing the information they can in real time. And to Sahara's point and others, it's a matter of some of us devoting more of our time and energy to public sharing of our work. I think that needs to be part of the consideration for what we do academically and all of that as well. So I would agree that I think going on offense, if you will, sharing the information we think needs to be shared is an important part of this. I also think part of it is a better effort to educate people as to where scientific evidence comes from, the scientific process, reasons why we can change our minds sometimes. We did a horrible job of that during the early days of the pandemic, where we make initial pronouncements about not needing masks, but then not pointing out that might change. I think that that's something that we just have to, if we give people that kind of encouragement to realize we're all in this together, we're going to do the best we can to come up with the best advice and acknowledgement, best advice for you and recommendations. Be patient with this, because we're going to be continuing to learn something as this unfolds. In the case of the pandemic, I think we would be in a better spot. So again, I don't want to go over your time here, but I really appreciate all these comments. I'm happy to address any others, either now or offline. And as I said, I'm happy to connect with people in different places. You can find me on LinkedIn and other kinds of places as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Southwell. It was such an inspiring and practical talk, and thank you everyone for coming. And Brian, if you have anything like articles or preprints you want to share with the audiences today, send me an email. I can forward the information to everyone attending today. So that was fantastic. Thanks again. And everyone, thanks for coming, and have a great day.
Great. Thanks, everybody.